Thank you. All right, so canonization of the scriptures. Matt suggested the topic. Emily gave me some other ideas about where to go with it. And so I wanted to acknowledge their contribution. If you think it's a dumb topic, talk to Matt.
So the reason why I brought it up, and this is an important thing, so our mission center, so Minnesota, Wisconsin, part of Illinois, right? We have applied to be a member of the Minnesota Council of Churches, right? We're a member of the National Council of Churches. We have applied to be a member of the Minnesota. And it took us 2 years, and they finally said, no, we don't want you as a member of the Minnesota Council of Churches. And their rationale for that is because the Minnesota Council of Churches, they changed their bylaws because of us, so there's that, only allows churches that have a closed canon of the Old and New Testament. So we are the community of Christ, so we have the Old Testament, we have the New Testament, and those are our primary sources of Scripture, but we also have what we call the Doctrine and Covenants,
which is open.
Which is open, because we believe that God is still possible today. So I wanted to kind of walk through how does things get canonized? Because in my mind, it's a bit weird for, and as we were driving up, I also realized they wouldn't allow the Catholics in either, because the Catholics have the Apocrypha, which is not a member of the old.
Well, they might.
But it's not, they listed out Old and New Testament.
They specifically said Old Testament.
Yeah, but the Apocrypha is part of the Old Testament. It is. I mean, and I think most people accept that. So I mean, my Bible has the Apocrypha in it, so the one I usually use. Yeah, New Jerusalem has.
New Jerusalem does, but they're other than. Anyway, that's what got me thinking. What does it really mean to be canon? What does that even mean?
And if we have time, we'll actually get to our church canonization, but that's the very last thing. So that means I'll probably be doing it in the third, installment of this 3 months from now. I also wanted to thank Emily, who's not here, for selling me a computer this week. She works at Best Buy in Dubuque, and I went and bought a computer from her. But it almost messed me up because I had to give them my old computer to move everything over. And I realized after I'd done that I wasn't sure I had this presentation available, ready to go. And I guessed it was on this flash drive. I backed it up on it, and I was right. But normally at the end of the week, I go through and edit and pare things down. I didn't do that this time because I didn't have a way to, because I don't have a computer at home. So we'll see how it goes. Let's look at 1 million definitions, okay? The word canon. The books of the Bible recognized by any Christian church as genuine and inspired. So the Minnesota Council of Churches, their canon is the Old and New Testament closed canon. That means it's no more stuff. Or any officially recognized set of sacred books like the sacred books of Buddhism or the Pali Canon. That's what their sacred scriptures are. It could be rules or laws or the body of ecclesiastical law referred to as canon law. So the rules, basically. In a sense, our Doctrine and Covenants is sort of like canon law. Kind of. Not exactly. Not quite in the same way that it is in the Catholics and the Methodists and so forth, but You can also have secular definitions. The body of rules, principles, standards as axiomatic and universally binding in a field of study or art. So like the geographical canon omits any notion of a flat earth because it's not flat.
It's not.
Because it's not. And so the canon omits that in geography. It could be the fundamental principles or general rule, the canons of good behavior. That means you do certain things, but you don't do other things if you want to do the right thing, right? Or standards, a comprehensive list of books within a field, like all books dealing with medical technology. That's the canon of medical technology. which is what Teresa is a medical technologist. The works of an author that have been accepted as authentic. There are 37 plays in the Shakespeare canon. And then this last one is interesting, and I thought it took me down. This is where Emily's rabbit hole took me. Established or agreed upon constraints governing the background, narrative, setting, storyline, characters of a particular fictional world. In other words, it's accepted as canon that vampires are harmed by sunlight. Now, the fact that vampires aren't real doesn't mean that that's not a rule. So if I wrote a vampire story and the vampire's out cavorting around in the middle of the day, everybody would say, that's not true, that's not right, because it violates a canon of a make-believe world, see? And there's lots of that kind of stuff going on. We're going to look at an example, okay, of that in just a moment. Okay. Canonization is the process of creating a canon, okay, especially in we'll say in a religious sense. But also it's what the term they use for enrollment of a dead person as a saint in the Roman Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church. So like if you want to canonize somebody, then that's the process is called canonization. Okay. Or it's also used as the official anointing of a person as a particularly influential person, like Meryl Streep has been canonized as the greatest living actress, and not too many people dispute that, you know. And so that's another way it can be used. And so the words canonical, relating to, established by, or conforming to a canon or canons, or in other words, it's stuff that's in the canon. If something is canonical, it's in the canon, okay? So I'll use that term occasionally if I can remember how to say it right. Okay, got it? It's a lot of monkey business, but let's look at the summary. For something to be canonical, it must be decided on by a group that has been granted authority to make canonical decisions. So I can't just decide that this is going to be canonical for our church because I don't have the authority to do that. It has to be somebody who has authority, and that authority has to be granted by a large, significant group, like in our case, by the rest of the church, by us. We have to agree that that person, whoever that person is, or that group, has the authority to say this is canonical. And you have to do it that way because otherwise, we've had this problem, and other churches have had this problem with people saying, oh no, this book is canonical, this book is, and all these little local congregations are saying, but this is what we think is, and that can get you down into some seriously weird places. So in our church, that significant group is World Conference. Okay, that's who decides on canonical stuff. The World Conference does in association with Doctrine and Covenants. The prophet, president, brings the revelation, but that doesn't make it canonical, and that doesn't put it in the scriptures. That doesn't put it in the canon. The World Conference has to decide. And so actually that's the group that's been granted authority, and the group granting the authority to World Conference is the rest of us in the church. Everybody see how that works?
We elect delegates.
We elect delegates. So if we send Matt to World Conference, then we're saying you can vote on our behalf. We give you the authority to vote on our behalf as to whether or not this is a good or bad revelation. But you also have to have consequences for violation of the canon. You can't just, in other words, there's a problem if you don't ascribe to it. So if I was preaching something really crazy, vampires are real, and Jesus was a vampire, and that's what I'm all about in my ministry, then everybody would say, sit down, shut up, and be good, because that's not canonical. There's a penalty to be paid for this. You have to be quiet because you're not saying the right thing. Okay, so that's kind of the overall look at that stuff, right? Secular canons. Here's one of my favorites. My camera is a Canon, and I like my camera. So,
How did you take the picture?
with my other little camera, I have two cameras. I'm such a geek. My other camera is my underwater camera. So, but that's a good question. How would you take the picture? The name Canon comes from Kanon, which is this in Japanese, which is the name of a Buddha's Bodhisattva, which is a person who's on the path towards becoming a Buddha in Buddhism. So anybody can become a Buddha, by the way. It's not just one Buddha. The goal is to become a Buddha, and Buddha comes from a word which means to be awake and to know what's happening, and that's where that's all coming from. So that's where it's tied up in Buddhism as the name of this Japanese camera that I am devoted to.
So how big?
Good, I did my job.
So how did this Buddhist term get to the idea of something? What in 400 and some odd, when they decided what was it, did they call it canonization at the time, or did they call it something else?
Like for Buddhism?
No, for Christianity. How did? Okay.
I don't understand. Oh, yeah, this is a Japanese word which transliterates this way into
Okay.
English.
So you're just speaking to the name on the canon.
Yeah, just strictly this. Yeah, this. No, the word canon, actually, I don't know if I have it in here, it comes from a Greek word, which is, it just happens to be the same kind of sound in two different unrelated languages. Sorry, I didn't make that clear, did I? Thank you for helping me clarify. So, the Constitution of the United States is a canon, okay? It has been authorized, agreed upon, and is accepted by a body of people, okay? And so it functions as a secular canon. So this is an example of canon law, okay? It dictates the structure of the government and is the foundation of the legal system in the United States. So it's a canon of law. The Constitutional Convention developed it. They were the authorized body who wrote this over a period of, 3 or 4 months in 1787. They were authorized by the people of the newly formed United States to do that, or actually not quite newly formed yet, but the Revolutionary War was over. And it's been granted the authority by the people of the United States. To go against the Constitution results in criminal proceedings or fines, or at the very least, you have to stop doing what you're doing. So that's the penalty for not abiding by the Constitution. And the Supreme Court, one of the 3 branches of government, their only function is to decide whether behaviors and laws are constitutional or not. That's the only function they have. That's how important constitutional law is, or the canon of law in the Constitution is. So we can look at an example, the constitutional requirements for the American presidency. Okay? There's only 3. You have to be a natural-born citizen of the United States. You have to be at least 35 years old. You have to be a resident of the United States for 14 years. So on this basis, I'm pretty sure everybody here could be president of the United States. I think we all meet these qualifications, right? Now, in my case, I was not born in the United States, but that's not what the Constitution says. It doesn't say you have to be born in the United States. It says you have to be a natural-born citizen. So I was born in Germany, and to illustrate the point, here's a photograph taken of me my first day of life. This is about 6 hours after I was born, because I had to get a passport to get from out of Germany back to where I was going. And it was a US passport, which means I was born as a citizen. Even though I was born in Germany, I could still be president of the United States. As John McCain was legal to be president of the United States, he was born in Panama Canal Zone, okay? But he was legal for the same reason, exactly the same reason, actually. Yeah, I just haven't shut up since, have I? Well, and my parents lived in France at the time, but we went to Germany to have babies because that was where at that time, where all the American couples went to have babies was in Wiesbaden, Germany. And so I had to get immediately back to France, and I had to have a passport. So I got a passport this day after I was born or something like that. But it was an American passport. That's the point. I was a citizen already. Okay? So in keeping with the First Amendment, there's no religious requirement for the presidency or any other elected office. You know? There's also no gender, ethnic, or sexual preference requirement, and there is no prohibition against convicted felons being president. So this election is going to give us a chance to see if we're going to be okay with a convicted felon being president of the United States. We get to find out if that it doesn't matter according to the Constitution. Now, are there non-constitutional requirements for the American presidency? Now, this is outside canon law, but there are things which so far have seemed to be requirements for the presidency, which are not in the Constitution. So we've had 46 presidents. There's never been a president that was female, never been one who's overtly LGBT, or one that was non-Christian, and only one that was non-white, and only 2 that were Catholics. So in practice, to be president, you had to be a white male Protestant, even though none of that is in the Constitution. But that's how it's evolved in our setting, you have to be white male Protestant. To be elected. Oh yeah, all kinds of people have run, but to be elected. So our culture has put those kinds of requirements on it as well. Despite the fact that most of us, or there's all this diversity in the United States. That's an unofficial addition to the US canon, a Constitution. So you can see how canons are kind of work that way. There's official stuff and there's also unofficial stuff. Now let's look at the suggestion from Emily, which I thought was a good one. Star Wars. Okay, Star Wars, of course, is a movie franchise which has flipped off into all kinds of other things. It's like an empire now. It's going to strike back one of these days. But the original Star Wars movie was released in 1977. It was an absolute sensation. It was unbelievable how it just blew up in American culture, you know, which is ensured that there was going to be sequels and all kinds of things like that. But it spawned another 8 films, the last released in 2019, as well as 2 anthology films, which were outside the arc of the story of the 9, but is still kind of peripheral to those stories. And that represents the canon. See, those 9 films and these 2 anthology films represents the canon of Star Wars. So, and this is all make-believe. I hate to tell you this, it's not documentaries. None of this has actually happened. So it's all a make-believe world. But even though the films are made up, anything having to do with Star Wars has to conform to these 9 films. It has to be consistent with these 9 films or else it's not real. You see, it's not right. It also, those 9 films, or actually 11 films, I guess, form the canon for all the other amazing television shows and video games and merchandising and all kinds of paraphernalia that goes along with the Star Wars universe. So there are 2 very good comedy parody songs by Weird Al Yankovic, which is based on Star Wars. I recommend them highly. I'm a big Weird Al fan, though, so there you go. They have to also be consistent with the Star Wars canon because it relies on the comedy of people recognizing the Star Wars canon and being consistent with that. He had to be consistent with it. If he hadn't have been, it wouldn't have been funny and he wouldn't have had 50 million views on YouTube for these 2 videos. Okay. Now, in the Star Wars world, people are getting really passionate about these things. So the first 6 movies were all made by George Lucas people, okay, his production company. Then Disney bought the rights to Star Wars and announced they were going to make 3 more films. And people were upset because it wasn't George Lucas. See, it was a non-George Lucas thing, so that they were wondering what they were really saying was, is this going to be canonical? Is this going to be, are we going to recognize this as Star Wars? Now, these films were all huge box office hits. So apparently people said, okay, yes, they are canonical, they are good. But see, the people had to vote on that, right? They had to represent that. It was the Star Wars fans that were the group that decided whether Disney had the authority to make 3 Star Wars movies. So what? So I thought I'd throw this in just for fun. Here's a few of the Star Wars villains in the canon. Okay, these are the bad guys. You're not supposed to like them, you know. But I would contend that of all of the canon, the one person or the one character which is most hated is not even a villain at all, is not represented here. It is Jar Jar Binks, who was in one of the 4th made movie. People hate this character. And the reason why they hate him is because something about his personality and the way he talks and the way he acts doesn't feel canonical. It doesn't feel like it belongs. That's what they're actually referring to. They don't think of it that way. They just don't like this character. And this was so strong that it almost sunk that movie. People really reacted strongly against it. So that's how people can vote on canonicity, you know, in that respect. So Yoda, it's not just the fact that it was a funny-looking, you know, puppet. Yoda was a funny-looking puppet, but it's probably the most beloved character in the Star Wars canon. And so we'll leave this little example by saying, "May the Force be with you," okay? Which is what he said about every other sentence. Okay. Now let's get to the Christian scriptures, okay? Now we've done the popular culture stuff. So canonization basically is asking the question, why did the Bible turn out to be the book that it is? Why does it have this stuff in it? This is a really, really, really important question because Christianity and Judaism to some degree, but Christianity in our case, has evolved as a religion because of what's in the Bible. If different stuff had been in the Bible, we would be a different religion. So it's really important to understand what was in the Bible and why. And that's what makes Christianity Christianity, okay? It's also important to realize that in the Christian world, there's not just one canonization. The Catholics and the Eastern Orthodox and the Protestants all have different Bibles, okay? And so they each had a different canonization process. We're going to focus on basically what amounts to the Catholic canonization because it was the one that gave us the most of the Bible that we use. And Eastern Orthodox and Protestants use that Bible more or less, okay? Okay, we'll skip Sola Scriptura for now. It's a little bit too complicated. We're running out of time already. Let's look at the early books of the Bible. Okay, so you know how it worked. Jesus was here, crucified, resurrected, gone. And then the church was developing with a bunch of people who initially in the first generation had known Jesus and been with Jesus. And they had the authority to do that. Paul didn't know Jesus directly, but was granted that authority because of his vision on the road to Damascus where Jesus appeared to him. So it's like he had been with Jesus also. And so Paul's really important in this whole process. So eventually these handful of people who had been with Jesus and had authority to do so were writing stuff. And we don't know, it probably started right away, but we don't know about a lot of that. The earliest books that we have come from 50 to 51 AD. These are the 2 Thessalonian books that Paul wrote to the Thessalonians, a city in Greece. And they were letters, but they had the force of Scripture, and they were circulating as divine words, and congregations were starting to accept that this was an authoritative thing that Paul was writing. He was just writing letters, though. Okay? That was about 20 years after Jesus was crucified. What happened in those 20 years, we don't know. We don't have anything from that period of time, but maybe there were other things circulating as well. From 56 to 58 AD, Paul was especially productive. Philippians, 1st, 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, and Romans all came from that time period. And they were all letters, the congregations, which also took on the force of Scripture and were circulating, but nobody had said, let's make a Bible out of this. They were just saying, hey, did you see the letter from Paul? Here, read this, that kind of stuff. And then he had another burst of productivity between 61 and 65. Ephesians, Colossians, Philemon, 1st and 2nd Timothy, and Titus. Did he write all those? Maybe not. But somebody associated with him wrote them at least. And it was Pauline theology, so we call those letters of Paul as well. And then he stopped writing because he was executed, which is a good reason to stop writing.
Terrible reason to stop writing.
It's a terrible reason, but it is a reason. Now, about that time, Mark wrote the first oldest gospel that we have, okay, about 64. And then Matthew and Luke were written maybe within the next 10 years, probably about 10 years later, based on Mark and based on another source, which we would love to get our hands on the original, Q source, because it was really important in Matthew and Luke. We can reconstruct it based on what Matthew and Luke wrote, but we don't have the original document. So that document was out there somewhere too. We just can't find the original. So all of these books, plus a bunch of other ones, including a bunch that did not make it into the New Testament, were circulating through the Eastern Mediterranean. And people who traveled from congregation to congregation would take copies and say, do you see the latest from Paul, or do you see Luke's gospel, or whatever, And by about 100 AD, John wrote his gospel, because it came later. And so we're starting to see some of the books that we now think of as the New Testament, but they were randomly circulating along with a whole bunch of other ones. So this is an interesting time. Not all the congregations are going to have access to all those books, right? And not all those congregations are going to have access to the same version of all those books, because Romans probably was copied and may have had slight differences, right? But somehow we've got to sort all this out and make a Bible out of all this, right? It's also really important to remember that this is the time period, about approximately 100 AD, but in that those decades, when Christianity was evolving as a separate religion on its own, not just a denomination of Judaism. And so forming a new religion is hard work, because you've got to decide, what do we stand for? Who are we? What kind of people are we going to be, right? What are we going to believe? We're not going to be Jews anymore, but what are we going to believe? This is a really important process. And there was a lot of Paul's letters kind of addressed this, in a sense. The first beginnings of this in the 60s. He was saying, this is what we believe. This is what a Christian believes. Stop believing what you're believing. Boy, he really gave the Corinthians fits, because the Corinthians had all kinds of interesting ideas about what a Christian was that Paul didn't like at all. And Paul was constantly calling them down. And all those other books are circulating too, saying this is what Christians are. This is what it means to be a Christian. Some of those books were later judged to be heretical, because that's not what it means to be a Christian. At least we decided that's not what it means to be a Christian. And how did we decide that? Basically, because we didn't put them in the Bible. You know? And so this is why canonization is so important, because there are some really strange things that were being circulated in the name of Christianity that we could believe today if they had been put in the Bible. And we would be a different church, a different kind of religion. So the problem is congregations were spread out all over the Eastern Mediterranean. Okay, this is pretty much all the congregations that we know of, approximately as of 90, 95 AD, something like that, by the end of the first century. And you can see that they're scattered, concentration here, a big concentration here. This is Paul's work up in here, trying to get the Greek church going, a few in Rome, but that's it. But these are widely scattered, and they didn't have, you know, of course, obviously, direct communication with each other, except for really long time periods between letters and between missives and things that were written. So these congregations are going to start developing their own theology. This always happens when you have isolated congregations. They start developing their own theology. This is the basis of folk religion. Okay? And so one of the things that Paul and some of the other epistle writers were really interested in doing was trying to corral and bring all these people into one body of ideas rather than have all these other oddball things. I'm not even going to tell you what the Corinthians were up to, but they were a long way from what we today think of as Christianity. They were calling it Christianity. Okay? So that's what we're talking about here. Here you go. It's canon is derived from a Greek word that means a measuring line or a ruler, something that you can hold up against there and find out if it's right. And so they needed this. They needed a canon so that people could say, okay, I believe such and such and such and such. Okay, does that fit with this canon of Scripture? And if not, maybe I'll leave the church because I want to believe that, or maybe I'll say, oh, well, I'm going to stop believing that and believe what the canon says. You know, hopefully is what's going to happen, but that's how that works, right? So the whole idea of bringing all these books together into an authoritative canon was all about trying to provide something so we could measure up what's going on out there with what is right. And what is right was going to be decided by a group of people, right? And if you give them authority to make that decision, you'll stay as a Christian. If you don't, you'll leave. You see. There's all kinds of implications on this for today's world, not in the secular world, but we don't want to go there. Okay, Marcion was as far as we know, was the first person to put together a canon of scriptures. Marcion was probably a Gnostic. He certainly loved Paul and thought Paul was the bee's knees, as they say. And so his Bible, which came out in 140 AD, he was excommunicated 4 years later as a heretic, by the way, because he was a Gnostic. He was preaching that the Old Testament God was not the same God as the New Testament God, and things like that, which is not what Jesus said, certainly. It is not what Paul said, even though Marcion loved Paul. But he had 10 of Paul's epistles and his own, which he edited, and his own edited version of Luke's Gospel. And he edited them to make his, excuse me, make his views, or make them consistent with his views. Okay, so he edited them basically to make them look more Gnostic. So it wasn't particularly accepted, but we talk about it because it was the first time anybody tried to do this, tried to bring them together and say, this is authoritative. It turns out people didn't accept it as authoritative, people rejected it. But this is the drive towards canonization was due partially to the opposition of the edited books of Marcion. People said, okay, we don't like what he did. Maybe we should try to come up with our own. We should come up with something which does work, which is, authoritative. So Christians after this began to look at texts to see if they aligned well with the canon. And they started to define what it was Christian and eliminate things they thought was heresy. And that was a big deal because there was a lot of stuff out there. Imagine going on the social media. Most of social media is junk, right? Most of it's wrong. I once read a survey, somebody did a thing that said at least 70% of everything on social media is completely wrong. So how would you go through there and clean that up? That's basically what they had to do. They had to create a canon that was going to determine what's right and what's wrong. So this way of looking at religious texts is still common in Christianity today. If I come up with a teaching or a thing, then people are going to say, is it consistent with the scriptures? And if it is, good. If it's not, sit down and shut up, right? That's exactly what would happen. At least that's what should happen. The way the world is today, I could probably put it on social media, develop my own following, and make $1 million. Irenaeus, really important dude, one of the church fathers. We're going to talk about the church fathers here a little bit. That's a title given to a group of people who were particularly authoritative and particularly influential in the early Christian church. Okay. Forceful opponent of heresy, especially of Gnosticism. He attacked heresy in his writings, and in his writings he referenced passages from all 27 of the current New Testament, except for Philemon, 2 Peter, 3 John, and Jude. So 23 of the 27. This is the first time we could see kind of what we're looking at today's New Testament being used as a canon. Okay, because he was saying these other things are wrong because they don't comport with these books. He said there are only 4 Gospels. There are lots of Gospels out there, tons of Gospels. I mean, everybody was writing Gospels. He said only 4 of them. And he came up with 4 because there are 4 cardinal wind directions and 4 cardinal areas where the winds blow from. He thought 4 was a magic number. But he said John, Luke, Matthew, Mark, he put them in that order. He also accepted Shepherd of Hermes and First Clement. We'll talk about those later. And he eliminated a whole bunch of stuff, especially Gnostic texts from the Bible. So the reason why Christianity isn't more Gnostic is mostly because of Irenaeus. Origen was another one of these church fathers, probably the greatest theologian of the era, one of the 2. This modern Origen scholar calls him the greatest genius of the early Christian church. So, in his writings, he accepted all 27 current New Testament books except for 2nd and 3rd John. So he's also looking at the same canon or body of works that Irenaeus did. And so we're starting to see some of these church fathers gravitating towards certain books. But he also accepted, like Irenaeus, Shepherd of Hermes and First Clement. And we'll see later on, these 2 books almost made it into the scriptures. They were real close. So the Easter letter, which comes a couple hundred years later, or 100 years later, which declared accepted Christian writings, was basically based on Origen, even though he was long dead. Okay, so let's look at the Easter letter. Okay, the bishops of Alexandria, which is in Egypt today, wrote an Easter letter every year because Easter comes on different days every year, right? It's not on one day. So they write this Easter letter, basically tell people when Easter was going to be. Okay, he was this guy was the most important of all the bishops of Alexandria, and wrote 45 Easter letters in his career. The 39th was the important one. 367 AD. In that letter, he listed the 27 books we now have in the New Testament. He was the first person to list those 27. Okay, and referred to them using the phrase, they're being canonized. That's important. So by this point, 367, they're thinking, we have to canonize the scriptures. We have to get a book. And these 27 are in play. Other books were in play too, though. This wasn't just these 27. The other books were in play too. But it's the earliest list of the current New Testament we know of. He also listed the Old Testament. And in keeping with Jewish tradition, he listed 22 books in the Old Testament. There are 39 Old Testament books. But actually, he got pretty much all of them because a lot of these books were two books that we have now pushed together into one book in the old days. So, I mean, First and Second Kings was Kings. First and Second Chronicles was Chronicles. You know, you got it. Yeah, you get the idea. So there was just this decision made at this point. We need to have an authoritative king. We've got to do this. And so they started holding a series of councils. Important people come together to hash this out. And the Council of Rome, 382 AD, issued a list of books identical to the 27 current books of the New Testament. The next year, Damasus, the Pope, commissioned the Latin Vulgate edition of the Bible, which is huge. That's still the version they use today. And that helped fix the canon. Now that version had these 27 books in the New Testament, but also had the Old Testament plus the 7 books of the Apocrypha in the Old Testament, okay? So that the Vulgate has that. All Catholic Bibles still have that, okay? So that was here. The Vulgate is hugely influential here. Because once that had papal imprimatur, that was the Bible, then what was in that book was authoritative. You know. Now, a hotbed of Christianity at this time was here in North Africa, around what is now Tunisia, around the city of Carthage. And there were 3 councils in this time period, all held at Carthage, all influenced by Augustine. And Augustine is the most important theologian of the first 1,000 years of Christianity by a long margin. He was all that. And he influenced all of these. One of the things that's interesting is in an effort to placate the Eastern churches, Augustine used his prestige to get Hebrews included. Hebrews was almost not included because almost everybody assumed it wasn't authoritative. Paul didn't really write it, you know. And Augustine, but the people in the East really liked it. And Augustine's trying to hold the church together. And so he used his influence to get Hebrews in. That's how close Hebrews came to not being in the canon. 2 popes, Innocent and Gelasius, each repeated the same index of books that the councils at Carthage had, giving them their imprimatur. At this point, the canon was done, pretty much. Although Revelation was a hard sell. It was almost certainly the last book put into the canon. There was a lot of debate about whether it should be in there or not. One scholar said it was added to the canon before 19 AD, although that seems a little late. But anyway, Augustine said, okay, the canon's closed now. And his authority was so great that everybody said, okay, we agree, canon's closed. So by about 400 or so, we have the Bible we have now. At that point, if you were non-canonical and written a non-canonical text, you just saw them fall away. People just stopped reading them, and they stopped being important. Yeah. It would have been closed anyway, probably, but Augustine was the guy who declared it closed, and he was so influential. Everybody said, yes, we agree. I think because everybody said we need to have a canon. We need to have an authoritative book. We can't keep, wrestling with this issue. We need to say it's closed, we're done, and we can go forward now. Because I guess they didn't want somebody to write something 50 years later and have become really popular, and everybody said, what about this? Why can't we put this in the New Testament? Whatever. So he declared it closed. So according to traditional Christianity, according to the Minnesota Council of Churches, the canon has been closed for 1,600 years or so. The Protestant canon, however, is a little different. In the first half of the 1500s, we're talking 1,000 years later now, Martin Luther took the 7 Old Testament books in the Apocrypha, which he didn't like. He said they're not equal to the Holy Scriptures, but they're useful and good to read. So Tobit, 1st and 2nd Manassas, or Maccabees, Judith, all these wisdom. These are all some of the apocryphal books in the Old Testament. Oh, here they are. Sirach, Baruch. They're still in Roman Catholic books, but they're not in Protestant Bibles because we're not like the Catholics, right? That's what the Protestants did. And there were a bunch of confessions of faith in different places in Europe, which affirmed the current 27 books of the New Testament by name, and also the 39 books of the Old Testament by name. And so this fixed the Protestant canon at that point, which is basically the same as the Catholic canon, except for the Apocrypha in the Old Testament, basically. Now, I found this to be particularly interesting. We'll see how much time we have for this, but what about the books that didn't make it? What were in those books? And there were lots of them, so we can't go through all of them. What were in those books? What were they about? Why were they not accepted? Because these were all being read. Some of them were very popular. Why did they not get accepted? Well, there were all kinds of gospels that were being written in 5 categories: general gospels, Jewish Christian gospels, infancy gospels, passion gospels, and Gnostic gospels. The general gospels, there's at least 12 of those. There may have been quite a few more, at least just what we know of. But a lot of these are considered lost. We only know about them because somebody referenced them in a writing. I was reading the Gospel of Andrew, and he said, blah, 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 but that's all we've got. So we know it existed, we just don't have it. So here's Andrew, Bartholomew, Barnabas, Valentius. All these wrote Gospels, and there's at least 8 more. Okay, so we're not going to do much with those. The Jewish Christian Gospels, there's probably 3 of these. These are all lost as well, but they're referenced by church fathers. People have spent a lot of time trying to sort this out and figure out what was in these books, but we're not going to mess with that either, okay? Infancy Gospels, there's a lot of these too. The Gospels we have don't talk that much, don't talk hardly at all about Jesus' boyhood, right? They just skip over it. This was a fertile field for people to fill in the gaps. And there were all kinds of people who wanted to do that, who talked about Jesus' birth and his boyhood. Okay? A lot of this is really speculative information. So we have the Gospel of James, the infancy Gospel of Thomas, the history of Joseph the Carpenter, the Gospel of the Nativity of Mary, and there's at least 4 more. infancy Gospels. I thought we'd look at a couple of these. The Gospel of James, in circulation by 150 AD, is actually more about Mary than about Jesus. It describes the miraculous conception of Mary, her upbringing and marriage to Joseph, the journey to Bethlehem, the birth of Jesus, and the events immediately after that. This is the book which is strongest in asserting the perpetual virginity of Mary. This book is all about that. That's what this book was written to do, basically, was to say that Mary was always a virgin, period. It says that Joseph was married before he met Mary and had been widowed and had a bunch of kids from that marriage that he brought to his marriage with Mary. Now, of course, none of this is in the Gospels we have, yeah. It explains a lot. And what it does is these are the brothers and sisters of Jesus that are mentioned in the Scriptures, because the Scriptures mention that Jesus had brothers and sisters. Always been a problem, because if those are the brothers and sisters of Jesus, how could Mary be perpetually virgin? You know? And so the Catholic Church translates that brothers and sisters as cousins, because they are hooked into the perpetual virginity of Mary. So this says they were step-siblings. Now, this book was condemned by the Pope in 405, but it was a very influential source for all things Mary. So people, a lot of the stuff that people say about Mary came from this book, apparently. The Infancy Gospel of Thomas is a bizarre book, really strange, written about 150 to 180 AD. It was in circulation by 180, ascribed to the Apostle Thomas, but it wasn't, because Thomas was dead by 150 AD. But it covers Jesus' boyhood from ages 5 to 12. And totally a bunch of made-up stuff. At least we assume it's made-up stuff. Little baby Jesus, little boy Jesus is working miracles. He takes clay, makes birds out of them, shapes of birds and brings them to life and lets them fly away. That kind of stuff. There's lots of stuff like this. But he also is an arrogant child who is vindictive. And one kid, depends on which translation you look at, either bumped him or hit him with a rock, and Jesus turned around and killed him. Supernaturally killed him as a boy. And there's a lot of that kind of stuff in there too. So this was, as you might guess, condemned by a lot of church leaders. And part of this gospel is actually found in the Quran, the Muslim book of scriptures. Of course, the Quran has a lot about Jesus in it, a lot about Jesus. And so it's not too surprising that they might have included some of this. The Passion Gospels is the central point of Jesus' life for a lot of people, his crucifixion and ascension and resurrection and so forth. And there's at least 7 of these Passion Gospels, and you see some of them here. The Gospel of Peter, ascribed to Apostle Peter, but not clearly not written by him. It puts the blame for the crucifixion of Jesus on Herod Antipas rather than on Pontius Pilate. So it's often seen as being an anti-Jewish sort of thing. As the Christians are trying to develop their own identity apart from Judaism, there was some sort of unfortunate anti-Semitism that came in. John kind of has some of that too. And so that's how this looks at it. It's also docetic, which a docetism argues that Jesus was not really human, but only appeared to be human. Seems Gnostic also, because the Gnostics were all about how much better the spirit was in the physical body. The docetism is what kept it out of being the Bible, declared heretical about 200 AD. They also had the resurrection and ascension of Jesus happening at the same time. Resurrected and went right to heaven. Gospel of Nicodemus has 2 parts. The first is an account of the trial of Jesus, which was based on Luke 23. The second part is called the heralding of hell, in which two souls raised from the dead after the crucifixion relate see Jesus during his descent to hell after being glorified, before being glorified. So Jesus went into hell. This is, was crucified, dead, and buried, descended into hell, was raised. That's one of the Apostles' Creed, isn't it? And so they have information about that, which is missing in every other gospel. It also has the names of the soldier who speared Jesus, Longinus, and the names of the two criminals crucified by Jesus, Dismas and Augustus. So now you know that. The Gnostic Gospels, boy, there's a lot of these. Gnosticism was such a big deal. There's at least 20 of these. Of course, they were all wiped out when Gnosticism became heretical, right? The Gospel of Mary, they're not sure, scholars aren't sure who the Mary is. It's so important in this. It was either the mother of Jesus, his sister named Mary, or Mary Magdalene. And this takes place mostly after the resurrection. Jesus is talking to the disciples. He leaves, in their sadness that he's left. They turn to Mary and say, who they describe as the woman he loved above all others, and ask them to tell him secret stuff that Jesus had shared only with her. And that makes up most of the rest of the book. And Mary describes a vision she had in which her accounts are doubted by Peter and Andrew, which scholars think foreshadows the division in the church. There was a lot of dissension in the early church about authority and who was in charge and things like that. This is almost clearly a Gnostic gospel, but it has inspired a lot of music and art. Lots of music and art over the years has come from the inspiration of this. The Gospel of Philip. This is also a Gnostic gospel. I have the wrong term there. Gnostic gospel. Related to the Gospel of Mary, has sayings of Jesus, some of which are found in the canonical Gospels, some which are found in the Gospel of Thomas, focuses on sacraments, especially marriage, and ascribes to Mary Magdalene a special relationship and insight into Jesus' teaching. So Mary Magdalene emerges as the important person in this. And here's a quote from that. It says, there were three who always walked with the Lord, Mary, his mother, and her sister, his sister, and Magdalene, the one who was called his companion. His sister and his mother and his companion was each a Mary. This gospel strongly suggests that Mary Magdalene was the wife of Jesus. And because that word companion is often translated, there's another place. Is often translated as spouse. But it says at one point that Jesus kissed Mary Magdalene, although the kind of kiss is not clear spelled out. It's kind of corrupted in the text at that point. It could be a full-blown on-the-mouth kiss. It could have been on the forehead kiss. We don't know. So there's a strong tradition in Christianity that Mary Magdalene was the wife of Jesus. I mean, this is a pretty strong tradition that's gone back for a long time, still is current today. And the Gospel of Philip is one of the sources for that. There were other books not included. There were at least 17 books called Acts, 16 epistles, 9 apocalypses. The Acts of Andrews. I think we'll skip some of this. Although Eusebius, another one of the church fathers, denounced the Acts of Andrew as absurd and the work of a heretic. So, the Acts of Peter and the Acts of John were also passed over because this is based on those two acts. Here's First Clement, an example of an epistle, a letter, written by Clement, Bishop of Rome, about 96 AD, to Corinth. I like this one because Paul wrote his letters to the Corinthians in the 60s, and he wrote 4 of them. and they just were not getting their act together, and they had all these bizarre beliefs and so forth. In 96, he calls on the Corinthian saints to repent again. They're still misbehaving. The same theme Paul had in his 4 letters 30-some years before. And he actually says in that letter, Clement references Paul's earlier letters, is basically saying, go back and read those again and do what he said. You know. In this case, the Corinthians had deposed a group of elders, and Clement is telling them to repent and reinstall them to their positions. And he also talks about the second coming, which hasn't happened yet. It says, don't lose your faith, something Paul said to them too. This was a really popular epistle. It was included in a lot of the lists of books for the New Testament and was one of the very last ones to be rejected. It's not clear exactly why it was rejected because it's clearly authoritative and matches, maybe it's because it kind of recovers the same ground that Paul covered in the Corinthian letters. You know, martyrdom of Polycarp. This is a letter. He was a real person who died in this time period. It's basically a manual on how to be a Christian martyr. This is what you do when you get killed. It's really interesting. He turns himself into Rome to save his 2 companions, but he refuses to say the Roman emperor is a god, so they burn him. They're going to burn him, but the fire doesn't touch him. It makes a ring around him, but it doesn't touch him. And so they stab him, and he gushes blood out, and the blood puts the fire out. But he dies. Then they burn his body, and so. The Shepherd of Hermes, strongly allegorical book. Finish up here. Really popular, really popular for hundreds of years. The shepherd is a heavenly messenger who appears to Hermes as a former slave, teaches him through allegories and allusions a lot of Christian teachings, strong sense of morals and Jewish influence, seems to have a knowledge of Revelations, talking about tribulation at the end times. People love this book. Irenaeus accepted it, Origen accepted it, but it didn't make the cut, probably because at one point he implies that Jesus was originally all human and evolved into divinity. And that was not canon teachings at that point. But it was probably the last book cut out. So Shepherd Hermes was probably the strongest book that was not included. Clement I and the Martyrdom of Polycarp both were almost made it in the New Testament, came very close. And almost didn't make it were Hebrews and Revelation, as we said before. I mean, even as late as in the 300s, Eusebius, really influential guy writing on the books of the Bible, said the book comes after the accepted books of the New Testament and describes the book as both accepted and rejected. That's Revelation. So there's a lot of ambiguity about Revelation. People didn't like the book. Some did, some didn't. And it has probably caused more problems than any other book in the Bible in the years since then. So maybe it would have been a good idea not to have it, but who knows. Okay, I have 2 slides here for the RLDS Community of Christ. We just accepted the King James Version of the Bible as the basis for the inspired version, and so we just accepted the canonization. We didn't do anything with that. The inspired version, 11% of it is changes that Joseph Smith made. 89% of it is just the traditional King James Version. So we had to canonize that 11%, right? It was just simply done because Joseph was a prophet. That's why I said, oh, Joseph's a prophet, that's right. You know? I guess that's a form of canonization, because you have an authority, Joseph, and you have people who accept it, the body of the church. The Book of Mormon was done the same way. You know, Joseph said, I did this, here it is, and everybody said, okay, we accept it. Now, the Doctrine and Covenants, as we pointed out, is, of course, the authoritative body is the World Conference. and they vote on it, whether it's accepted or not, and the rest of the church accepts it at that point. As far as I know, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think there's never been a revelation which has not been accepted. And our closest was Frederick Madison Smith.
Yeah.
With just about, there was almost a revolution in the church in the 1920s on Frederick Madison Smith's revelation. But that was close. It had to do with, I think, the form of Zion it's going to take. Do you remember that?
I don't.
I can't remember the details.
That was the closest, but we've also.
Well, 156 too.
They sent the president back to consider some more.
Yeah.
And we're not ready to vote on it yet. That's the closest.
That's a good point. That is a form of rejection, but not a total rejection. So the World Conference actually does have power. They're not going to just rubber stamp everything, you know. So.
And in more recent years, the World, like the prophet president, rather than, I would say up until this millennium, at World Conference is when we're bringing in the recommendations of Dr. Conference, we won't have that week of order.
Right.
They presented possibly years before the
right.
church stew on
it.
Talk about it.
Which makes more sense to me.
It absolutely does. So more recent ones have been released as guidance, but not recommendations.
Yeah.
After a year because that's when people stew on it and say, yeah, that's that.
Yeah.
But up until recently.
Yeah.
Hey, it's April. Here's the
new stuff. You got 5 days. So that's it. I'm done. I'm sorry to keep you 7 minutes after. I would have pared down some of that if I'd had access to that drive. Anyway, any other comments or questions? You see how canonization works and why it's so darn important. You know. They changed.
For whatever reason, there was something about us that they didn't get well with.
It probably was that.
And
we had to go back. So we had I was prepared actually for like kind of worked on this application. And so we had an interview with another meeting with working with the driver. And